Hello, and thank you for joining us on the Anarchist Experience. I'm your host. My name is Robert Kruger, and today I have Jake Tompkins from Red and Black Media, or Red and what is it? Red and Black
It's Red and Black Revolutionary. That's my YouTube channel.
Red and Black Revolutionary podcast. Yeah, or it's a vlog, or is it a?
I more just make videos. It's not a specific type of videos that I do. So just videos that I find. Sometimes they're scripted, sometimes they're vlogs, sometimes it's just videos. You can just call me Red and Black Revolutionary.
All right, so looks like we've got a little feedback coming through. So let's see if we can mute that.
Okay.
I think it's coming from Hagbard, who's joined us.
Oh, Hagbard is here. That's cool.
I'm not hearing the feedback. All right, so we're good.
Yeah.
If you are watching live, of course, I'm watching the comments to see what people have to say. So if you'd like to contribute, or if you'd like to have somebody ask a question or something like that, we're watching, so we can include you. All right. So as far as I understood it, you wanted to discuss the difference between private property and personal property. So why don't you go ahead and give us your explanation as to what the difference between the two are?
I mean, so there's a couple things I want to talk about with this. Number one is there's two there's two definitions for personal property. Private property is there's like one definition for private property that I accept, and then there's two definitions that for personal property. One being the personal property that anarchists accept, and the other being a different kind of personal property. So when anarchists say they accept personal property, what they're talking about is not necessarily it's kind of misleading, because what they're talking about is not necessarily property in the sense that you would think about it typically, right? So it's not what comes in your head when you typically think property. In fact, personal possession is something that more applies to the term. So when anarchists say, okay, well, we would accept personal property, what they're saying is, okay, well, we would accept personal possessions. So, and what they mean by that is, so anarchists typically advocate what's called a commons for resources, right? And so things would be under that they would be collectively controlled, collectively managed, collectively owned, whatever you want to say. No one has the exclusive claim over that. And what happens is under a system of personal possession, these things are allocated to people, so boundaries are set. So it's like, okay, so we're giving you this land we're giving you possession of this land for a given purpose. So you're occupying that land, whatever the object is, you're occupying it for a given use, but it's not exclusively controlled by you. Other people have input into the management of that, and it's an equal input. So that's what anarchists say when they accept personal property. It's not necessarily property as you might think about it. Now, as far as the other definition of personal property goes, then there's also property which is not means of production that can be exclusively owned. So that's another definition of personal property. So there's that's kind of a twofold thing in the sense of that word.
But
Private
you don't accept the latter one.
Yeah. So private property would be and this is something that I feel both sides are confused on. Private property is simply the exclusive ownership of the means of production, right?
Okay.
Some people attach absentee to that, and I don't think that you need to, because that's by definition absentee as the means of production or something that everybody uses. And so, I don't think you need to attach absentee to that. ANCAPs often say, oh, well, private property is just things that are not owned by the state, that are owned by individuals outside the state. That is not true either. It's ownership of the means of production, which in fact requires a state apparatus to maintain the ownership claim over.
Okay. So just for clarity's sake, I'd like to go through some examples, and we'll go from the most basic and obvious one that would be accepted as you have the right to ownership over, under what you're saying, and then we'll go towards the ones that are the most obtuse that you wouldn't accept. So let's say, for example, dental filling.
Hmm.
A dental filling is pretty obviously my dental filling. No one else can say, "Oh, I'm going to go ahead and use your dental filling for some other purpose." Um, the idea of having somebody else using my dental filling for some other purpose is ridiculous, right?
Hmm.
Okay, so that's definitely yours. And if you so chose to drill it out of your head and use it for some other purpose, then does it no longer become yours? Maybe.
All right.
Um,
So, are you asking me the question, or are you just going through the examples?
well, I think that, I mean, you would say that it might depend, I would think. I mean, is that
I
something?
mean, I think what needs to be done in that case is there needs to be responsible management of those resources by those communities, right? So obviously, if you're talking about something that's going to be going into someone's body, it needs to be responsibly managed. It can't just be like, okay, we're going to have it just sitting there for any purpose. It needs to be okay, you know, uh, is this something, it needs to be responsibly managed. So that's what I would say in that situation. Um, I do think that there should be resource commons for everything, but I think that there are certain things that you need to be extremely careful with, like things that are going to people's bodies, like prosthetic legs and hip replacements and things like that. That needs to be extremely. You need to be extremely careful with that, obviously, because that is obnoxiously important, to those people. So.
So, theoretically, though, if, let's say, for example, we're using some rather rare material in order to put together prosthetic hips,
Mhm.
and we've got, I don't know, let's say 0.1% of the population or 0.01% of the population has these prosthetic hips implanted in them. And then a scenario happens where this particular material is essential for some other purpose.
Mhm.
Okay, at this point, do we now debate whether or not we can go back into these people's bodies and remove their hips so that we can use that material for this purpose?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to have to depend on what the purpose is, right? So let's say the material would need to be would be something that would be the only material that we could have, and that material in that person's body is like the only place that we could get it, or not getting it from that person's body would cause shortages, whatever,
Okay,
and then and that's the only way we could do, like, say the thing of a hole in like a dam or some shit, and it's gonna, like, I mean, this is obviously not gonna happen, but
yeah, of course. It's a
in
totally
that
ludicrous
critical
example, but the
example.
point,
So in that
yeah.
example, I think that, yeah, you'd probably should go back into that person's body and take it out, because if you don't, millions of people are going to drown. But so it just depends on the situation. You can't
Mhm.
really make a general philosophical rule for that. You need to be flexible on those kinds of matters.
All right, so then let's go to something that's a fairly easy example. Let's say that we have a certain percentage of the population that has, I don't know, been born with some sort of tumors or had some sort of cancer, things of that nature,
Mm-hmm.
and without a donor for a kidney, will die.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then this point we have nobody volunteering beyond a certain number. I mean, we certainly would get some volunteers, but they're insufficient to the task. We have probably another 100,000 people who are going to die because of renal failure. Um, but we have two kidneys each, and obviously, if we take a kidney, from people through a lottery or other methods where we say, all right, well, we're going to allocate your kidneys to these people who will die without them.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that you think is a legitimate, plan of appropriate
I
management?
mean, again, it just kind of depends. Like, it depends on who that person is, how essential their, I mean, the given people involved, how essential their kind of, abilities are to social life, how it's going to affect them personally, how it's going to affect the people around them. It's going to heavily depend. So I can't draw
Well, I don't know. Make it the best case scenario for your argument. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, we have a person who is, I don't know, we've got a group of people who have these particular problems, and the reason why they had these problems is because they've been working in a very dangerous field where they're exposed to radiation that we can't prevent.
Mm-hmm.
They've developed a skill set to use the tools and the equipment to handle these particular resources in a very highly important area that's kind of, maybe we're facing extinction from a thing hitting the planet, and they're working on something to get us off the planet.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So we now have all of these workers who are capable of putting together the things that we need, but at this point we need to go ahead and get them kidneys, and there's not enough volunteers to get them kidneys. And so now the people that we're going to potentially take the kidneys from, they're, I don't know, bums, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So at this point, then, the proper management of these resources would be to take them from the bums and give them to the workers who have developed these skills, who know what they're doing with these tools.
I suppose. I mean, I would take issue. I mean, is this just in any society, or is it within the society that I advocate?
I'm talking about like the anarchist society that you're talking about.
There wouldn't be, bums, I don't know, bums. That's not an advent of an anarchist society.
Okay, I'm talking about people who just essentially are not producing anything of any significance. They're
You're asking disaster questions. That's really all you're doing. I don't really get the point of that. You're like, what if an asteroid hits the Earth? What if there's this extreme disaster where you need to take from some people in order to save millions? It's like those are really questions that deal with normative ethics and such. But
the purpose of the question is to address the point that he said, that you have to manage it, and then he said it depends upon the nature of the people. Okay, and so I said in this case, an example where you would have some people who are very important and vitally important to the society, and you had other people who were relatively unimportant.
Mm-hmm.
So you're saying, what do you do on the lifeboat scenario where
it actually doesn't have to be a lifeboat scenario.
It doesn't have to be, but it doesn't have to be a lifeboat scenario. But you can make an analogy to one where there's only one person who knows how to boat, for example, and then other people don't. Obviously, the person who knows how to use the lifeboat and understands the navigation and whatnot, that would be. I still don't get the point of asking the disaster questions in the first place.
The point is, what I've gathered is that this is it's a conversation about metaphysics. So we're talking about the ethics of it right now. So that's why he's asking the disaster scenarios. He's it's a question about the underlying ethics that may be leading into a question about practical application. I don't know what his intentions are. He would have to speak on that. But he's just asking the pure ethics of it right now, not necessarily the practical application of those ethics.
Right. I guess the best way to deal with that is I'm a two-tier consequentialist, which means I use rules unless in a disaster scenarios, and then there are different rules, and the rules break down for those disaster scenarios. And there's better and worse ways to deal with those disaster scenarios. Whether or not we have the best answer for the particular disaster scenario you bring up off the top of our heads or not, there's better and worse ways to deal with them, conducive towards meeting well-being of people and that we're dependent upon. So
I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that there are points where, let's say, I, as a person who would probably disagree with this particular perspective, I could put a scenario together like I just did, where I would stand forth and say, yes, I would actually say we do have to go ahead and take kidneys from other people and give them to the people who we need in order for the species to survive. Okay, so the point was to bring a sense of consensus between, or respect and understanding between the two perspectives. And then we can move into a more, all right, well, this is not as much of a, pragmatically required response.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so then, that's the purpose of the question.
Right. Well, I guess what we should really be concerned with is what socioeconomic system minimizes such disaster scenarios and allows us to deal with them in the best possible ways. Then.
Well, that's an interesting topic to have at some point. Yeah, sure. I'd like to finish the one that we're on though.
Keep going. Keep going.
Okay, so Jake, you were obviously in the scenario that I presented, it's very clear that we've got people who, without which we will die as a
Mhm.
species. Very
Right.
clear, obvious type of thing. And you would say, what? We do that as a
I would
social.
say that yeah, you would have to allocate the proper resources to the people who were important in that scenario, the most important people.
So then if we move out from that and move into a less drastic and dire scenario, how far removed from that the species will die versus just the people who don't get the kidneys will die.
Mm-hmm.
Um, do you have to go? I mean, how important does a person have to be in order to justify taking a kidney from a person who doesn't want you to take their kidney?
Well, so I'm an anarchist, obviously, and anarchists believe in maximizing autonomy in social relationships. So that how we apply that and how that's going to work is going to have to be upon that principle, right? So that's going to have to depend, and that depends severely on the given social relation. So, for example, within, to say someone's beating their wife, and is it going to, we might be violating their autonomy by not letting them beat their wife, but if we let them beat their wife, we're establishing, the right of domination over, of that person over their wife. And so, we are creating an authoritarian structure where autonomy is not maximized. So if we're to maximize autonomy, we're going to have to stop the person from beating their wife and not give people the right to beat their wives. So, it's not to say that wives would exist or marriage would exist in an anarchist society. I don't think it would, but that's, it's just for the sake of the example. So, that's kind of that's how we have to go about it. So let's say if, the person who needed the kidney was a person who knew how to do proper, for the ANCAP's economic calculation, right? And he was the only guy within however 100-mile radius, and he was extremely important to the community. And the person that, we would be taking the kidneys from would be somebody who just, he is not as important. I think that in that situation, if the community is going to suffer extremely greatly, so they're not going to, say, he was the only guy within the however mile radius, and they could not get another person to do it, then I'd say it's justified. But in a more practical example where, we have all kinds of people in the world, and, there would probably be people willing to go live there and do that guy's job, then I don't think we would be justified in taking the kidney from the other person, right? So
Right.
it's about maximizing the autonomy. That's the general rule.
Okay, so we get around to a situation where we've got somebody, let's say they're a comedian. They're considered to be one of the funniest comedians in this community. Let's say it's Rodney Dangerfield for some crazy reason. I don't think he's particularly funny, but whatever. And we got the Rodney Dangerfield who has been a boozer, and he's got a liver that's going to go bad. And the community feels that, well, without this type of entertainment, our society, suffers a loss of significant level of some sort. And so therefore we're going to, Joe over here is a dullard. Nobody really likes him. He's just kind of a, I don't know, he goes in and he does his thing, and he doesn't really, matter much. So at this point, because we all benefit so much from the laughter and enjoyment of Mr. Dangerfield, let's go ahead and reallocate the liver from this person to him.
I think
Seems pretty obviously not the same level, right?
Yeah, no, it's not the same level. So but it does depend. So if, let's say, everyone in the community would have no other choice but to kill themselves, they would be that lost without Mr. Dangerfield's entertainment, right? Then I think it'd be justified. But if we're talking about, it's just something that they do on Sunday nights that they find particularly entertaining, I don't think it would be.
Okay. So the thing that's very clear, at least to me, is that when it's pragmatically required or necessity of a society to survive, it's clear that sometimes you have to let those rules that you would
Hold
normally
on.
accept.
There's food.
Yeah, thank you. All right, keep going.
You would let those rules that you would normally follow kind of down a little bit in order to satisfy the necessities of existence.
Right.
So when it comes to the other things, when we're starting to consider, well, how valuable and so on something is, then we have to go into some sort of negotiation of what is of significant enough value to then violate it. And to me, it's a pretty clear line that if there is death that will occur without this action, then obviously you might choose to act, but it doesn't necessarily, in my mind, absolve the person from having done wrong to the other party.
Mm-hmm.
So, in the case of, let's say, if we had the workers who were, doing the thing that we had to have happen in order to survive, but we took kidneys from people, these people are still alive, but their lives are diminished. And in that regard, I would think that it would be mandated that, or not mandated, but only appropriate that the actors that were involved in the taking of their kidneys would be basically indebted to them to a significant degree.
Right.
Regardless of how noble their goal was, they still violated another person.
All right.
Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree.
So then now we have to weigh the negative of having these losses, or these negative things that you're going to have to do that are going to absorb your time in order to help these people with the kidney things, because you now have to do whatever it is that makes things okay for these other people too. So it's not just a simple cut and dry, well, we feel justified in taking your kidneys and we'll move on. It's we feel justified in taking your kidneys and then also having redress to you.
Right. Yeah.
So, right. So clearly, I think that we have some similarity there in the way that we believe that there's some sort of, debt that is created by doing something of that nature. All right. So then, if we move into the separate things, the things that are obviously not integral to the person's body and so on, toothbrush type of thing. A toothbrush is very easy to understand. All right, well, if I take your toothbrush, it's kind of annoying, but I mean, realistically, if the purpose is significant, maybe it's justified. Okay. But do you similarly have this claim of redress against you? It says,
I would think you would.
Okay.
How do we prevent toothbrush scarcity? That's the real question we need to be asking. And all of these questions, or a vast majority of them, are preventable given the technology available, the resources available. It's just a matter of a socioeconomic structure that allows them to actually be distributed according to people's needs and preferences.
Which is capitalism. But
no.
It's okay.
That is not capitalism.
Well, we're going to disagree on that. And so, we've had that type of discussion and disagreement from time to time. The analysis of the various different intricacies of these two different systems helps to get us to understand them better. And if we want to have a debate between whether or not an RBE or capitalism would properly create plenty, which would do a better job of it, then we could have that debate. But I
guess that's the basic thing. A market both requires a certain degree of scarcity, and then it creates an output of scarcity. That's part of what a market does.
Well, that's an interesting topic to go into.
If supply and demand were met, there wouldn't be any buying and selling of things because people would have what they needed.
Okay. Well, specifically though, Jake is wanted to discuss the difference between private and personal property, and so at this
Mhm.
point, that's the topic that we are working on.
I mean, we could go into different topics. I said my piece. If you have objections, you can levy them if you
All
want.
right. Well, I do
I'm
have
valuable.
objections.
I don't have any discussion preferences, really. I can talk about anything.
All
And
right.
I
Well,
would
I
go
do.
as far as saying that personal property is a right. People have the right to own the shelter that they use, and no landlord has the right to take that away from them. So if people want shelter, that's what they can use and own.
Okay. So you guys actually would disagree about that then?
I don't necessarily think so, but
Well,
ask Jake. I don't know.
I
um,
mean, like, this is like the thing. Like, I think that ANCOMs or whatever, anarchists, in their discussions like about occupancy and use with ANCAPs, the thing that is not getting across is that what we were talking about with personal property is not necessarily property as you think about it. It's possession. So it's like, yeah, we're going to set a line so that you have some monopoly over the things that you are using, but it has to be there has to be rights of control. Like those lines have to be set collectively. It can't
okay.
just be like I'm going to monopolize resources for myself and give no one else input. And I think Hagbeard would agree with that.
Yes, I don't believe in the right to conspicuous consumption. I believe in the right to owning that which one needs and uses for utility. I don't believe in people owning stuff for status at the expense of other people's needs and preferences.
Right. So that's what we're trying to get across with the personal property thing.
Okay.
And caps, since they have different conceptions of property, when we say personal property, they think, oh well, if it's not, maybe like it's weird because they have this idea. It's like, oh well, maybe then I can randomly monopolize the control of my house, like and give no one else collective input, right? And that's not how it works. There has to be collective input. That's what is trying to be gotten across, and that doesn't really get across. And I think even some ANCOMs are confused about. So
All right. So then, to clarify, then you would say that when somebody has a home, a domicile, that this domicile is actually on loan from the collective.
What do you mean loan?
That you get to use it, that's fine. You get to decide what goes on with it, that's fine. But anytime that we decide that you're using
Doesn't
it in an
doesn't
appropriate.
a loan though imply that you have to pay someone back? I mean, that's not what it really is. It's about
Okay,
more.
maybe
It's
it's the
that
wrong word.
it's that there's different claims. It's that you can, for example, if there's no one around you, you can theoretically just claim a couple acres. But now if there's a couple people moving into that area, or here's a good one. Here's an interesting example. You build a house and then you move somewhere else. But you built that house and then somebody else takes that over. And while you're living somewhere else at another house that you're using, so you might have a certain claim to that house, and then the other person who's living in it has a certain claim to that house, and your claim might be weaker because you have another place to live, and they've been using it since you were gone. So two people can have claims to a certain piece of property, but one claim can be greater than the other.
Okay, yeah. I think that within the ANCAP perspective, that there would be something called, abandonment, where someone has sufficiently, left whatever property open to return to the unowned. So I don't know. Let's say, for example, if a person were to have a home that they live in, and they were to go on a vacation for a month. Okay, and after about 4 days, um, another another group of people move into this home, and then they return from their vacation, and they see, well, what the hell is going on here? And they talk to their neighbors, and they're like, well, why didn't you say anything to this guy? You know I was coming back from my vacation. And so there's this big old discussion and dispute about who owns the home. And theoretically, the original owners would probably return and have ownership over the land, or control over the land,
That's
over the
something.
home.
That's something that might be interesting because I ANCAPs, like their conception of property rights is basically it's based on what they call first appropriation, where if you go out and you mix your labor with nature, that thing is yours, or if you obtain it through trade on the voluntary market, whatever that means. I don't think markets are voluntary, but trade on the voluntary market where nothing is, where basically where you acquire it directly through just trade, that isn't
Or gifting.
coerced in any way or whatever, and then or someone gifts it to you. So that's the ANCAP conception of property, and I find that to be extremely erroneous, because like if we're talking about meeting the needs of the population, obviously, we can't just say, all right, well, if I mixed my labor with this tree, it is now mine. I don't think that that's a good enough claim, because what happens if, that somebody needs that tree for firewood or whatever? Like, people have needs that they need to have satisfied,
Sure.
and when you're just monopolizing things because, I went out and peed on a bush in the woods, like, you're not, like, that's ridiculous. And then if we talk about the market, I don't, like, the market is kind of, that ties into that. In the market, you cannot, you physically, like, there are social rules that prohibit you from access to things on the market unless you participate in exchange. So unless you have the the social power of commodities backing you up, you don't have any claim to any resources, and you're done. I mean, I would love to go out and get go out to the convenience store and get some food or whatever, and that would have just pretty much zero effect on anybody. But I can't, because we live in a market, and I don't have the money I need to trade for that food, right? So there's the thing about the market, like it's not, like, this is just not an efficient way of meeting needs, and it's domination, like, just on very principle, it's domination. It's
well, I do want to kind of like try to clarify some things that you're saying for people who are ANCAPs who might be wrenching themselves over the ideas that you're suggesting, and I'd like to maybe put something a little bit more where it makes these concepts a little bit more clear, in that you're not coming out of left field on this thing, because I mean, I certainly don't necessarily agree with you in our world, but I can see an example or a situation where it's very clear that this type of approach would be necessitated. If we are on a spaceship that is being, that is going to transport the human population to another planet, well, there's a certain limited amount of resources that we're working with, and if you start to try to apply yours this way, and then somebody else needs it in order to survive, or if the group needs it for some other purpose, clearly we have to reallocate these particular resources, and there's no final claim that you can just say, okay, well, this is mine because I made it.
Right. So for the ANCAPs, we're applying that to everything, every resource. Right. That's what anarchists want to do. They want to apply that to every resource, not just in dire situation.
Right.
And by the way, on a spaceship, there's limited resources, just like Earth, and that's why we can't really afford economic warfare as a mechanism for managing resources, because when profit is the proxy for rationing resources, it will meet human happiness only to the degree that it will maximize profit. It will also create suffering to the degree that it will maximize profit. It will also destroy resources unnecessarily, use them in an unintelligible way to the extent that it will maximize profit. And using profit as a measurement of resources, when cost efficiency is put before resource efficiency and technical efficiency at every stage of production without exception, that's the way you create artificial scarcity, meaning avoidable scarcity, or scarcity created by our socioeconomic systems as opposed to natural scarcity or the finitude of resources that exists.
Okay. Well, addressing a particular topic and going through it, in a linear fashion is something that I really enjoy doing. And, talking about things in a more generalistic, shotgun approach where we're talking about point this, really doesn't allow us to go into the depth or the clarity that is required for each individual component. So
right. Well, you gave an example where you're on a spaceship and there's limited resources.
Yeah, clearly.
And if we're going to use profit as a proxy for managing those resources, that will create suffering to the degree that will create profit, and you're going to get artificial, avoidable scarcity.
Okay.
Also, I think there's a question of what profit is in a capitalist society. Profit in a capitalist society is what Marx termed the extraction of surplus value. So, or just value in general. So, what happens in a capitalist society is resources are monopolized for certain social bodies and individuals, and what happens is people's access to those resources are limited based on their buying power, right? So I can't, it's instead of it being a mutual relationship where we both try to maximize each other's happiness. It's a relationship of domination where I have to give up resources that I have for resources that's somebody else has, because they will not allow me access to the resources that I need, unless I exchange with them. And then I'm doing the same thing, vice versa. So it's kind of instead of a kind of a relationship where power is shared, it's a mutual domination. That is what's happening, right? And so it's kind of this extremely socially corrosive weirdness where people, instead of their interactions actually being through voluntary choice, as ANCAPs love to talk about, it's through coerced violence on the part of state thugs as well, because we cannot retain these monopolies over resources without the state.
Also, the state does exploitation as well through taxation, and I think that's the way a lot of philosophical capitalists will be able to understand where we're coming from with exploitation. Taxation is the extraction of surplus value, exists by the landlord to the tenant, from the boss.
Breaking up there. Hagbard, you're breaking up.
What he was trying to say.
Up. Well,
all right. Go ahead, Jake.
Oh, well, I mean, I was just going to say he was saying that, and this is something that Marx even.
The taxation is kind of the same kind of thing.
Right? Yeah, taxation is also extraction of surplus value. It's the same thing. It's the forceful taking of value, which are, in Marx's mind, commodities. So, that's what he was trying to say.
Right. And I get that. All right. So, the thing that we were addressing with as far as like the personal property versus the private property thing. In essence, though, you're actually saying that there is no such thing as personal property. There is personal, management, or like you're in charge of this stuff. You've got authority over it, at least as long as the community in the group that we're a part of does not retake that authority from you.
Well, I would say that's truncated on a couple levels. Number one, that's what we were talking. That's like what I was trying to say before. What ANCOMs are talking about when they say, okay, we'll accept personal property, that's what they're talking about. They're not talking about property as maybe like what pops into ANCAP's minds when they hear property.
Right. So it's not actually property then. It's
not property in that sense. It's property in the sense that we're talking about. Also, it's not just the particular community. We're talking about the global society here. We're not talking about isolated individual instances. We're talking about the whole economy, the whole of humanity that participates in these relations and is affected by these resources.
Right. And so this goes back kind of similarly to the spacecraft analogy that that since we are basically on a spacecraft, I mean we have a planet that is kind of a somewhat closed environment, even though we're getting continuous input from the sun. I mean it's kind of like a steady flow, not necessarily a unlimited supply of energy that's coming there. And it's a relatively closed environment. So in this particular case, since we have a relatively closed environment, it is your perspective that we need to have a system of discussion and consensus that helps to properly direct these particular resources that we have towards positive ends that minimize waste.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, and does that fit with you, Hagbard?
I would say to meet human needs, meet preferences to the greatest degree we can, while keeping in mind free association. I come from the school of thought known as social ecology, which is that our environmental problems are social problems in disguise. and that the way we organize amongst ourselves affects the environment, and then the environment affect us in a kind of a dialogue between humans, our socioeconomic, our environment. So, in my opinion, it's through using the market and using profit as a proxy for rationing resources that will destroy resources and destroy resource efficiency, if you will, to the degree that that will maximize profit. It will also save resources to the degree that it maximizes profit.
Okay. Now, when it comes to the word profit, that's being bandied around, and I know that when it comes to incomes, the idea of profit, it sounds like a somewhat negative term, or a term that they wouldn't even want to have used in their particular society. That the term profit would just not even exist. Is that correct, or am I mistaken?
Well, I mean, profit. I mean, I don't know if there's a universal ANCOM on this, but I think profit has a connotation that anarchists and ANCOMs should reject, and that any sensible person should reject. I don't see profit as simply having good things done for you. That's truncated. I see profit as an economic factor within capitalism that implies the forceful extraction of resources from other people, by other people.
All right, so the term profit then doesn't necessarily mean the same thing in the different applications then.
In terms of the two schools of thought, no.
All right, so like if I said the word, to me the word profit is basically has my circumstance improved? If it has, then I have profited.
That would be profitable to your circumstance, you could say, but that's just one thing. That's just taking the word profit and using it without its economic definition. Within economics, it has a very different definition than a metaphor of profit in regards to benefiting. I think that's also like something I see from philosophical capitalists often, is that they will sort of use market language to describe interactions that don't necessarily have anything to do with that at all. And everything is seen in terms of profit and lack thereof. What did you say?
I said that's quite frustrating. I mean, I know from my own experience that when for example, there's a particular person who makes the claim that that people own stuff, and it's obvious that you own stuff because right now you just said something, and I can hear what you said, and you own that argument, or else did maybe Jake actually say that? I mean, obviously you own that you said it, right? And this is a conflation of the two words own and the different meanings of the word own, and it's a bad thought process. So using words that mean two different things interchangeably, even though they are the same word as far as the phonetics of it and the print of it, does not make it a logical thought process. So we want to make sure.
I would actually go farther. I would say that the term profit in the connotation that you're using it comes out of an incorrect paradigm. It comes out of the paradigm of what's called bourgeois economics, and bourgeois economists trying to extrapolate principles that they like to basic social relations that we would all accept. So yeah, everybody wants good happen to them. So, what do the bourgeois propagandists want to do? Well, they want to extrapolate that and just make it they want to take that term, which applies to market social relations that have negative connotations, and they want to take that and they want to say, oh, well, it's just gaining. Like, it's the same thing when people say, oh, well, markets are just voluntary interaction. If I go up and I hug my friend, that's a market, right? That's the same shit. And I'm not saying that you yourself are trying to
No.
things or whatever. I think you're being earnest. Who I don't think are being earnest are the people that actually devised these things, which are the front groups and the propagandists behind the bourgeois economists, like Milton Friedman, like Rothbard. They were not those people themselves, but they had those people fueling their ideas, right? And these are where these economics comes from, and that goes for the economics that liberals advocate. That goes for the economics that ANCAPs advocate. That goes for all of the schools of bourgeois economics, which are economics that aim to apologize for capitalism.
Okay, so obviously, I'm not a big fan of the cult of personality type of thing. So I like to use logic and reason to determine what it is that I'm going to follow, what activities I'm going to follow. And I do believe that if we're in a society that has some sort of claim that we're going to manage resources according to a consensus or even direct democracy or whatever, that this is a claim of ownership. Okay, now it may not be a claim of ownership by a single person, but it is a claim of ownership by the person who espouses that the majority is correct or that the consensus is correct.
I mean, it depends on what context you're using. I mean, there is a context in which ownership, like the context you're using ownership in, is acceptable, but it's not ownership in other I'm sorry for the burp. It's not ownership in other contexts where it's just exclusive control, because the control is being exerted by all parties, not exclusively by a certain party. So it depends on what you're saying ownership is.
But it is exclusive context. It is exclusive control. Now, I'll give you an example. Let's say that we come to the consensus. I'm sorry, what was that? I didn't catch that. What was it?
I think you might be lagging up.
Okay. You might be lagging out, Tagbird. All right, so I'll continue. All right, it is exclusive control, and I'll give you the example. We're going to, say, have a consensus upon our society that says we're going to allocate these particular fields towards the productive use of, for some reason we think that corn is the best thing to be used to use it for. Okay, and then I come along and say, well, I want to grow marijuana. And I think it's more important to me. So I plant marijuana in the fields. Okay, and you come along and say you can't plant marijuana in these fields. These fields are for corn. All right, you're excluding me from being able to plant marijuana in those fields. Okay, so it is exclusive.
It's exclusive in some sense, yes, but it's not the exclusive right of control because other people have, input into it. Ownership in the sense that I'm talking about, and there is a sense that you're talking about, but ownership in the sense that I'm talking about is the exclusive right of control over things.
Right. Well, the exclusive right of control over things is according to whichever system that you wanted to use, either the mob, the majority, or the consensus, which is the popular.
That's not exclusive, though. If it's done by consensus, if it's done by a consensus that's overreaching to the whole society, which is, the human society, then it's not exclusive. It overreaches to the whole society.
Oh, but it is exclusive in that the people who are the most popular have the most influence upon the consensus.
But that's not in the sense of social rights. If we're talking about this in the sense of social rights, not in physical control. So yeah, people may accidentally or even on purpose exert control over others that would not fit into this model, right? But that's beyond the model. It's beyond the social rights that are given. So in this context, people would not have the social right to do it. They may do it, but they would not have the social right to do it. It would not be socially rewarded. It would be socially sanctioned to do something like that. So we're talking about social rights, not necessarily what people have the physical ability to do.
All right, so if it comes down to a disagreement about how this particular field will be used for whatever purpose, and just to clarify, are you a consensus-based person or are you a direct democracy?
They're the same thing.
No, they're not.
Yeah, they are.
They're different in my opinion, but they're interconnected because they're both based off of consent.
Yeah, they're both interconnected. Yes,
they're both based on consent-based social relations. One of them is majority preference within an association, and the other one is just everyone agreeing. But when it's majority preference, that majority consents to do what they want to do, and everybody who dissents can do what they want to do. So it's still based on consent in the sense. So at the end of the day, the people consenting all have consensus on a certain thing. So
that's the consensus model, though. If it's based on free agreements between people, right? Then that's what consensus is. That's consensus democracy. So it's kind of all the same principle to me.
Also, when you're assuming agriculture in a very like medieval sense, I think we would use aeroponic skyscrapers for a lot of agriculture to make it so there's enough of what everybody really needs and wants when it comes to that, without any exceptions. And you can use 90% plus less water, and you can use the least amount of space, the least amount of labor to grow the most amount of foods. And
100% agree. 100% agree. Now, the thing that we need to do here, though, is if I come up with an example of, that we're going to discuss, if the example is, workable as far as like talking about what the concepts that we're talking about, then we can move forward with the discussion on that. If we want to talk about new innovative technologies in other areas and so on, that's a different discussion.
Well, no, what I'm trying to say is we exist within a certain technical context. And when we take into consideration what technology exists, a lot of questions that might have even been debatable are answerable through pure just giving out what the technology is and what social system would need to exist for that technology to be liberatory. Because if that technology existed within capitalism, there would be a required amount of scarcity of food in order to even sell food. If you gave everyone free food, that would actually be bad for business. So you actually need a certain degree of scarcity of food within a market in order to have a market of food or a market of any particular resource.
Okay, and so what I'm saying is that in the discussion that we're talking about here, we're talking about who has the right of control, the final authority on decisions.
Okay, and I want to define 4 forms of ownership. One is personal ownership,
Okay.
which we
I would like to finish what I'm saying here, okay? All right, so in order for us to address this particular issue, this question, bringing up other things that don't have bearing on the issue creates a lack of a dialogue.
It doesn't, because I need to define my terms. How can I talk about terms if I haven't defined them? I want to define a couple terms.
I'm asking you to stop changing the subject.
I'm not trying to change the subject. I'm trying to define terms so I can answer your question. But I can't answer your question without defining terms, or I can just give all the definitions without defining them, which would be awkward for the viewers and for you, I think. But when it comes to ownership, I'm fine with personal ownership, which we've gone over, personal property. I'm fine with anti-authoritarian collective ownership through decentralized planning, participatory democracy, and free association. And I'm for community ownership over what the community uses. I'm not for the private ownership of what other people use. So I'm for those 3 forms, and I'm against private ownership of the means of production or the state ownership of the means of production, which is just a form of private ownership, although it's not the form that you advocate, but it is a form of private ownership over what other people use. In fact, I would call the state the privatization of the community.
I see. Well, I would have a disagreement with you on that. The term, to me, private versus public is not the way that we tend to use the term private in our parlance. We use the term private meaning anything that is not owned by or run by or dictated by the government. Right?
I'm well aware, and I think that ANCAPs definitely have a different. I think that their definition of private property has certain constraints, and it's different from the liberal definition of private property and the constraints that they would have. And the basic point that anarchists make when calling state property a form of private property is that the state isn't owned by the community. It's owned by the central planners of the state, and they control it, and they have to pretend to represent the community when it comes to pseudo-democratic states. They have to pretend to different degrees. That being said, at the end of the day, the community do not have control over the community resources. They don't have control over the common pool resources. That's been taken over either by state property, which is a form of private property, or private property within the liberal definition or capitalist definition of it.
Okay, I get you, and that's fine. We have had discussions about that kind of thing before, and I guess the thing that I'm wanting to get back to is the idea that, all right, we've got a resource, whether we're going to call it land that's being used for agriculture or whatever. Okay, we have a particular body of something that, we have some set amount of atoms. There's a set amount of atoms of something that are available for use for a variety of different purposes. Okay? And if the consensus or if the majority says that we want to use it for this particular end and this particular purpose, if the person in the minority or the group in the minority disagrees with that and attempts to use this scarce plot of land, or whether the atoms in a different way, then we have a disagreement, and then we have to come up with a resolution as to how those atoms will be used. Okay, and in the case of the ANCAP, the perspective is that if it was in an unowned, unclaimed state, that the first appropriator would then have made something new out of unclaimed and unowned stuff, and now is final determinant of the use of these materials, right? Because they're now in a new state, and they would not exist in this state had it not been for their action. So they have final authority over the decisions of how they're used. Now, in your response, Jake, you were saying that in the case of the consensus or the direct democracy, that basically it would be the majority that would make the decisions about the final use of these molecules, whatever they happen to be.
No. It would not be the majority. It would be everyone. I'm not advocating mob rule. I'm advocating, that everybody has an equal say in what goes on. A consensus democracy.
So if we had 75% of the population says, well, this land should be used for corn, and we had 25% of the population that said it should be used for marijuana, who wins, assuming that they're exclusive to each other?
Well, there would have to be some kind of compromise reached. That's the best answer I could give you.
You could even do 25% of the land cannabis, 75% of the land corn.
Okay.
Then again, we would be doing primitive agriculture. When you look at the statistics and
stop talking about primitive agriculture thing. I mean, it's just okay. We're talking about a concept, and we're using agriculture because it's easy for people.
But these are disaster scenarios that don't need to exist. That's what I think is so absurd.
It's not a disaster scenario. We're talking about people deciding how stuff should be used. All right, and you're saying that all right, we can have 75-25. All right, well then.
Or we can just grow as much as people need of all of that.
Yeah, sure. We could have flying unicorns that could have rainbows coming out of their butt.
That's not what I'm advocating. I'm advocating aeroponic skyscrapers.
I understand.
To grow food.
It's great. That's all fine and dandy. But there are times that you are going to have a resource that does not have the divisibility that you're desiring, and we will have a resource that does not have the infinite creatability that you can just ignore that it is limited. Right? So that's the question that we're trying to address, is that we have something that is limited in its potential use, and you have to have two people's differing opinions about how it's going to be used, and you have to decide which one is going to have the final word, the final say. All right? That's the point that we're trying to talk about. So,
the final say, that's kind of... who would have the final say is everyone within the society, right? Now, I understand your point that we need to resolve the conflict over the resource. It's not a matter of final say; it's a matter of who,
well, at some point,
decision we come to, right?
Right. At some point, it's used some way. It's used in option A or
right. Yeah, I know. Yeah, right. I'm just saying terms or whatever, but
okay.
So. I understand that point, and within anarchist structures, there would have to be people would have to work out some kind of compromise on the conflicts of resources. So either one party concedes to the other party concedes to the other party, or there's a compromise where both parties benefit in some way. So maybe to use an example, if there's one really rare thing that everybody likes. Maybe one person gets it and the other doesn't, but the other one person does a favor for the other person the next day or something. So that's kind of just a general rule. There has to be a compromise reached so that there's mutuality maintained in the relationship and there isn't domination. And that's the general rule. So.
All right.
And also, one other thing I'd like to add, we advocate free association, which includes the ability to disassociate from associations, which means that there's other associations you can go to. Whereas in the scenario where there's one field and there's this many people and they're trying to vote on what to use it, it's almost as if they don't have anywhere else they can go, which is a very like reductionist scenario. And that's not the way that the world would actually work that we advocate. Or in reality, that's just not the way the world is. There's other places you can go. So we're dealing with, it's not just one plot of land and a bunch of people. We have a whole planet, and it's through that interconnected system that we can solve answers. We can't solve answers just through looking at these things in reduction. We need to really look at the entire systems analysis of the planet and the resources available, the technology we have, and the decision-making power being proportionate to how decisions affect people. And society has a mechanism to reach maximum preferences met.
Okay, so when it comes to the criticisms of the anarcho-capitalist position, you indicated that we live in a world that is very much similar to the spaceship analogy that I gave, where we have a certain amount of oil that we're going to have, that will no longer be available if we continue to use it in the greedy seeking of profit, for example. And so we all have to worry about, all right, well, are we going to make sure that waste is disposed of in a way that doesn't create a stench for everyone else in the society and so on? I mean, we're all living in this world together, and so in this particular way, you're suggesting that, yes, we do live within a somewhat closed environment and a very limited environment, and so we do have potentially a scarce system to work with, all right? And I would agree with that, but now you're suggesting that we have kind of like this end-all, be-all type of solution where we are going to, end this particular type of concern so that it is not an issue and people can just, roam free and enjoy whatever it is that they want to enjoy, and no one can interfere. No one's efforts to interfere would matter because there's other opportunities all over the place.
Well, what I'm really just trying to point out is that we're talking about a system of free association, which means we want freedom from association. If you give us a scenario where there's a couple people voting on one field and that's the end-all be-all of fields, that's all they're given, it's reducing a complex system to a very simplistic system based off of musical chairs where there's not enough chairs to go around and we have to solve it. So it's back to a disaster scenario again. That's not the actual world we live in regards to the resources, the technology, or the actual way the world works. We have different associations. We can go places.
Right.
If one group wants to grow corn on one field, another group can grow cannabis on that field. And we don't live in a world where there's just one field. And I get what you're saying, that there might be scenarios where there is finitude of resources and there's not a technical fix in a sense to make it relatively abundant. That could totally exist. It's just that this wouldn't exist for the vast majority of resources, such as food, water, shelter, energy, the 50,000 plus resources that could be made through hemp,
right,
etc. And when you really get down to it, there might be a couple strange luxury items that are like that. But if we don't have a society that's mature enough to realize that we have to find a way to share that without starting conflicts and economic warfare with each other, where resources are sacrificed to the extent that it maximizes profit, then we're not going to get anywhere in the first place.
Okay, I do have a question from the comments on the YouTube thing. Let's see, Van Ree asks if I would ask you guys if either of you have ever studied praxeology. Jake?
I don't know that much about it. I have some ideas, but I'm not. I don't know too much about praxeology.
All right, and Hedbard?
So.
Well, I couldn't hear the question. My audio keeps freezing. What was it?
The comments section has asked me to ask you guys if you have ever studied praxeology.
I've delved into it a bit. It's one of my favorite comedy acts is praxeology. Behind I don't think it understands human behavior. Human behavior has nothing to do with that. We're not always acting rationally. That's absurd.
Oh, well, then it sounds like you've got a misunderstanding of what praxeology suggests.
Potentially.
Well, praxeology quite very clearly says that people act and they make decisions based upon their own internal mechanisms, which may not be rational.
Right.
Okay, so it doesn't presuppose rationality at all.
Well, and how would you define it as?
That human beings are decision makers, and therefore their decisions are based upon rationales that are within their own particular um, list of things that they can make their decisions based upon. The things that they value the most will weigh more heavily upon their decisions, and that people who have a very high value on their decisions to protect their family and their friends, and to see to their well-being, even if it is at the expense of other people in another neighborhood. That's potentially not a rational perspective, because if everybody had that, then we might have suffering for everyone. So, there's a lot of different ways of people determining how that their actions or their decisions will be taken, and the bottom line is, though, that human beings make decisions. Is that that's obviously an
Well,
understandable.
I agree that human beings make decisions. However, they don't make them in isolation of a
Oh,
biopsychosocial,
yeah.
ecological, technological context. So I
Oh, of
would
course.
say that
Yeah.
humans are making decisions, but we live in a causally determined um, universe.
Yeah. I think that.
If I may give my input,
Yeah.
what it sounds like to me is that the theory you gave, I've seen ANCAPs use it before,
Hmm.
and generally it seems to me that it's kind of just an attempt to justify market-based social relations by
Well.
bourgeois ideology, and that's kind of what they do. Like, so if you pressure, let's say, give an ANCAP on, you know, well, markets do this and that and this and that. What I've seen a lot of them do, and not all of them do this, obviously, but what I've seen a lot of them do is just say, stuff like that. Like, basically, nothing about the actual point, and just extract to it by saying, well, human beings make decisions and blah 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 blah. So,
Well, it's not just blah 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 blah. I mean, there's actually things that go into each of various different steps that you're moving upon. What I've found, on the other side of this particular conversation is that we'll get people who, instead of wanting to understand the aggregate effects um, through a method of understanding the individual moving forward in the different decision-making processes, and then how the creation of the understanding of how having something be more quote unquote expensive, and it doesn't necessarily have to be expensive in money. It can be expensive in the amount of time that you spend to acquire it. Um, how these different decisions are made through an economic understanding of, well, I only have a limited amount of time or energy or thought that I can spend on this particular goal. And
opportunity cost.
what's that?
Opportunity cost.
Yes, you've got opportunity cost that comes into it as well, and then all of these different things, all these different interactions factor into what is creating, in essence, a market. Now, this market does not have to use a societal preference for social grandiosity, where you've got people showing off their excess wealth and in an opulence display. That certainly is, in my opinion, an irrational use of your efforts. Some people think that it is a rational use of their efforts because they're jerks. But when it comes down to a society actually achieving the goals that it has before it, the um, the various different levels of this is the most important thing, this is the next most important thing, this is the next most important thing, and so on, for each individual factors into it, and then we go into an aggregate level, and so on. It's not it's not just a and blah blah blah. I mean, there's actually steps that go into every single step.
I mean, I understand that. It was just like, going over the theory quickly. I wasn't trying to say
Yeah.
that it was.
All right. Well, the
What?
thing that I also see though is that sometimes when it comes to ancoms and just plain anarchists, not ancaps, is that we'll start from the other end of things and work our way backwards and guess at what it is that are the causes. Where we'll have a society that's like ours, where we have an immense amount of suffering for people who are in countries like China and India, where you've got these people working in these horrible conditions. You've got opulence that's just incredibly and just gross looking in comparison. When you have people like Bill Gates, or not Bill Gates, let's say Donald Trump, with his golden apartment complex or whatever it was.
Mm.
These differences in wealth disparity are just obviously gross in afterthought when you're looking at them, and you're like, oh my God, what kind of a world do we live in where you could end up with this kind of disparity? And then they work backwards with this idea that, well, what the cause of this is this, that, the other thing, and we start to look at, point fingers at the people who are the possessors of this wealth, that they have achieved this wealth. Obviously, it's inappropriate that they have this amount of wealth, and while there is such suffering in the rest of the world. And so then we look at the various different characteristics that match these different people, and we say, all right, well, this guy is a capitalist, and this guy is a capitalist, and this guy is a capitalist, and they're all taking advantage of the fact that there are people who work underneath them who are creating stuff that they don't actually even put any freaking effort into making, so they're stealing. I mean, it's a very clear understanding, and and if we go at it backwards that way, yes, we can very easily make justifications that that it is that way. In fact, potentially though, somebody with a really in a very different perspective could say, well, what it is actually that they have been beneficiaries of the white supremacist power that has existed in this world since the Europeans and the British dominated and subjugated all these different countries around the world, and they're just living high on the hog after having oppressed and taken away all these people's resources and stuff. And so that they might say, well, it's because they're white. Well, it's not because they're white per se, it's because they have benefits that may have been primarily absorbed by people from white cultures. But the direct cause was not necessarily that they were white. The direct cause would be that they resources, or the like the enclosure movement, where they had resources and productivity that were granted to them through the state through the use of violence and threats, and saying, well, this is his land, and you're going to have to work out something with him. And so now move forward. Okay, and so there's a variety of different ways to blame whatever group it happens to be, or whatever thing that it happens to be. And NCAPs blame the state. Okay, and NCOMs blame capitalism and the state.
And the market. And the market.
In the market.
Well,
okay.
Capitalism entails the market, so.
It does, but the market doesn't necessarily entail capitalism.
Right, that is true. That is true.
However, I do think that the idea of a mutualist market is sort of a moral imposition onto a system that maximizes gains, and I think the best way to maximize gains in a market is to privately own the means of production, to extract the surplus value. So I think in many ways the market incentives go against the moral impositions that mutualists place on the market. But anyways, keep going.
So if you were to say that the market is the underlying cause, the underlying problem, and
I wouldn't, by the way, but keep going.
Oh, well, I mean, what is the underlying issue then? Is it the market, or I mean, you said that it isn't. So, is it the?
I would say the market and the state, but socioeconomic hierarchy can take other forms, such as white supremacy, or a patriarchal family, etc., etc.
I mean, like, I wouldn't like. ANCOMs do blame capitalism in the state in part, but for the large part, the ANCOM analysis is that the fault, where the fault lies is our tradition as a human society of authoritarian social relations, and that's the position that I take. So relationships of domination. So the ANCOM position typically is that those relationships reproduce themselves and lead to greater domination, such as capitalism and the state and all that in the market. And so that's what kind of happens. And so that's what the analysis by us usually is. And then there's, the Marxist analysis. They say, that everything in society springs from not all Marxists take this analysis, but it's the typical one where, all things spring from relations to production. So, it's the fault of, it exists because of the material stages of history. That is necessary for Marxism in a lot of respects. There's the NCAP analysis where it's the state through and through. It's, the state and people being evil, and et cetera, et cetera. And then there's, the liberal analysis, which is, some individual people, are bad. So,
All right. So, we're coming up on like 14 minutes left in the show, so I'm going to go ahead and take the ball and roll with it on this topic that we kind of blundered into, and so we're going to move, change speeds if you don't mind. And it's something that I find that we would probably find a fair amount of agreement on, but I'd just like to explore it with you guys. We have this idea that the authoritarian relationship is potentially a very negative thing as well. This mythology of authority is one of the things that Larkin Rose says, the greatest superstition. So I want to actually, bring it into, let's say, for example, the social dynamic for parenting. All right. So when it comes to the dynamic for parenting, let's say that you've got a child who's like 5, 6 years old, and they find that their parents are acting in ways that they don't like, and they are unhappy with them, and other people in the society who know this child offer to welcome them into their home and provide for them that way. What is your stance on parents and their children, and is there a hierarchical recognition that should be there, or is there not?
Well, my particular stance is, I think that children are inherent, from a certain, at a certain age, up to a certain age point, need some guidance within decision making if they are to, lead good lives, and they are to be able to, have the best chance at what they want. That being said, the way we do it in our society is stupid. So basically, the rationale in our society is children need guidance, so we're going to take basically ownership of them and act like that they're our property until they're 18 and out of the house, right? And so that's the way we do it in our society, and that's bullshit. That's domination. Instead of yes, giving them guidance, but ultimately trying to maximize their autonomy, we are just taking ownership of them until a certain age where 10 years of that process of children ownership, they're for 10 years of that process, they're not going to even need the guidance anymore. It's something that people don't need after 12 or 13. So it's it's stupid.
Well, just obviously, let's.
I have a slightly different answer, but related, which is just that I think the relationship should be of authorities. I'm fine with authoritarianism, and I would like to define a difference. There can be an authority without authoritarianism, and those are the only kind of authorities that are valid. And parent-child relationship or a teacher-student relationship could be like that, and it often.
Okay, so when we're talking about authority, you're saying that you don't want to include authority like I've been studying nutrition for 5 decades, and I know exactly how it is that human bodies do digestion, and therefore, if I'm giving a lecture on how it is a really bad idea to be ingesting all these starches and sugars without any protein or fat, then I have somebody jump up and say, no, no, man, it's all about the fat. The fat is what does it wrong. And people can very clearly say, shut up, he's the authority. That is an obvious example of where we're talking, authority is just kind of like a dual-use word. It's used in two different paradigms. And so when we're talking about authority that is unacceptable, it would be the authority that says, I am by default given permission to violate the norm.
And that would be an authoritarian social relation, and that's what I'm against. Behaviorally, systemically, etc.
So if there is a systemic or societal norm that creates a new type of person called an authority that has the abilities or the recognition to go ahead and do things that are outside of what we would expect for every other human being to do, this is not an acceptable relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's not an acceptable relationship for somebody to violate the decision-making powers of other people.
Okay, all right. So we're basically in agreement on that. Now, when we have this idea of who has the authority in a relationship when it comes to children, you were mentioning the idea of an age, Jake. Just to clarify, I don't think that you probably mean age. You're probably talking about some sort of capacity for making decisions. Is that
right?
Correct?
That's what I'm talking about, and that's typically reached within a certain period of someone's lifetime, so some within an age. That's the only part that it's it's correlated to someone's age. That's
all right. So I think that we would both agree that there comes a point where like an infant is physically incapable of making decisions and acting upon them in a certain regard when it comes to who is their caretaker and so on. But at the point that they get to where they can actually make these decisions, there comes a certain level of cognition that would allow them. And so, is there a specific level? How would you ascertain that they have reached that level of maturity in order to say, look, I want to go ahead and move in with this family over here because my parents over here are not providing for me the way that I like?
That depends on the given person, if you look into the psychology of it. But generally, that age is around 14, 15, 16, maybe 13 or 12 for some, early developers. So it's going to depend, but typically somewhere in the teenage years.
But obviously there would be outliers that would potentially be significantly younger.
Right.
And the form of the guidance is extremely important because we don't want punishment systems. We want all restraint-based. For example, I think it's fine for a parent to restrain their child from running into the street or anything else that might harm them that they're not aware of. I think that's totally fine. But there's a difference between that and then just seeking revenge upon your kid and telling them that they're only lovable if and when they comply with blank demand.
Right, and I think that it's pretty clear that if you would tackle somebody to prevent them from running into the oncoming train, it doesn't matter if they're a child or if they're an adult, you would do the same thing. So obviously,
right.
Yeah,
but I'm looking for a restraint-based parenting model based off of basically what Alfie Kohn advocates in his book Unconditional Parenting.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that book, but if you could send me something on Facebook to link me to it, I'd be interested in checking it out.
Will do.
Okay, so when it comes to the rearing of the children that we're talking about, and you have a child that is claiming that they have the cognition necessary to make this decision for their lives, and they want to go to another opportunity that has presented itself, a family that has invited them to join them, and they come forward and say, I want to switch over to that group and hang out with them. And where does this arbitration occur? I mean, how does the society that you imagine deal with that type of a request?
I would think that it has to be like whether or not that decision is actually honored has to be based on whether or not, to the best ability we can determine whether that person is actually ready or not. And if they are, let them do it. If it falls in line with the needs of everybody else, obviously. So
who's
like,
doing the letting?
if the person just goes over to somebody's house uninvited, and it would be a gradation on them to do so, and whatever. Obviously you have to take into account other people's needs, but so if it's in
Who
line
does
with
the
that.
letting that you're talking about? Let them do it. Who's the person that's
Well,
saying?
the society, the people around the person, that's kind of obvious. That's in the
No, it's not
content.
obvious. It's
It
something.
is pretty obvious, though. Like, who else? Like, I'm obviously an anarchist. I don't advocate state structures. I don't advocate authoritarian structures. So obviously, it'd have to be based on a horizontal structure of, community action and, solidarity.
Different communities, for example, might have different rules, but the people involved in the decision would make their decision based on those rules, but those rules would all be based off of anti-authoritarian principles, as Jake said.
Okay. So if we lived in a particularly, I don't know, like an Amish type society, the norms having been adjusted for an anarchistic Amish society, where we didn't have the ruling elders, so to speak, but they were instead advisors, and they're not saying the way that things have to be, but everybody just defers to them. Is there actually any significant difference? Because yes, they give their advice, and we don't have to obey it, but
people follow it blindly, kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an issue. There's a great Chomsky essay where he's writing about how there's this groupthink mentality that can happen, where people just sort of obey either what the group is saying, not in a rational way, or even what an authority figure says in a non-rational way, and that's an issue that we're going to have to deal with regardless if we have formal authoritarian structures or not. But you can certainly have different levels of domination without those formal structures, but the goal is minimizing all of that to the greatest degree possible, and that's why education is such an important aspect that's necessary for an anarchist society to function. If we don't have people who are if we have an extreme amount of ignorance, for example, it'll be hard not to fall into the trap of appeal to authority or groupthink mentality. And even if we do, we're trying to minimize those formal structures anyways, because that would create less harm overall. But we should get rid of all those. We should minimize those biases as well. Appeal to majority and appeal to authority.
All right. Well, I think that we would definitely have an agreement on that. That we want to have a society that has not only had an education in how to do the basic things like how to do addition or multiplication, but just the idea of learning how to do logic and rational thinking, so that they can evaluate various different assertions, various different claims, and make decisions through their own part in self-empowerment, instead of a society that says, all right, well, you should always trust this particular group because they're the quote-unquote experts, is something that we would probably all agree on. And so I guess what I'm just going to do is just leave it at that, and we'll have to look into some of these other ideas that you were talking about, like vertical farming and other novel technologies that may exist in a future world that we would live in, and whether anarcho-capitalism or anarcho-communism would achieve these more, which would more likely achieve them and which would create them, and so on, at another time. But at this point, I'd like to just go ahead and give you guys an opportunity to plug whatever sort of sources that our audience could go to check out what work that you've put together.
Mm-hmm. I have a YouTube channel and a Facebook page. You can find my Facebook page, both my personal Facebook page and the Facebook page for my YouTube, on my YouTube channel. My YouTube channel is RedAndBlackRevolutionary. Go and check that out if you're interested. I make videos about politics and philosophy and all that fucking crud. So that's me.
All right,
All
Nick.
right. Those technologies exist now, by the way. All right, so you can find me on Facebook.com/post-scarcity anarchism. Me and a couple of comrades manage that page. Post-scarcity anarchism on Fascist Book.
On Fascist Book, yes. All right. Well, again, thank you guys for joining me today on the Anarchist Experience, and thank you to the audience for joining us and checking out the show. I hope that everybody has a great week coming up, and make it a productive one. Thanks.